Learn English through Stories K1 PDF. Adapted and modified by Kulwant Singh Sandhu. Contents: Unlighted Lamps. Part 1. Unlighted Lamps. Part 1. By Sherwood Anderson. Mary Cochrane went out of the rooms where she lived with her father, Dr. Lester Cochrane, at 7 o'clock on a Sunday evening. It was June of the year 1908, and Mary was 18 years old. She walked along Tremont to Main Street and across the railroad tracks to Upper Main, lined with small shops and shoddy houses, a rather quiet, cheerless place on Sundays when there were few people about. She had told her father she was going to church, but did not intend doing anything of the kind. She did not know what she wanted to do. "I'll get off by myself and think," she told herself as she walked slowly along. The night she thought promised to be too fine to be spent sitting in a stuffy church and hearing a man talk of things that had apparently nothing to do with her own problem. Her own affairs were approaching a crisis, and it was time for her to begin thinking seriously of her future. The thoughtful, serious state of mind in which Mary found herself had been induced in her by a conversation had with her father on the evening before. Without any preliminary talk, and quite suddenly and abruptly, he had told her that he was a victim of heart disease and might die at any moment. He had made the announcement as they stood together in the doctor's office, back of which were the rooms in which the father and daughter lived. It was growing dark outside when she came into the office and found him sitting alone. The office and living rooms were on the second floor of an old frame building in the town of Huntersburg, Illinois, and as the doctor talked, he stood beside his daughter near one of the windows that looked down into Tremont Street. The hushed murmur of the town's Saturday night life went on in Main Street, just around a corner, and the evening train, bound to Chicago 50 miles to the east, had just passed. The hotel bus came rattling out of Lincoln Street and went through Tremont toward the hotel on Lower Main. A cloud of dust kicked up by the horses' hoofs floated on the quiet air. A straggling group of people followed the bus, and the row of hitching posts on Tremont Street was already lined with buggies in which farmers and their wives had driven into town for the evening of shopping and gossip. After the station bus had passed, 3 or 4 more buggies were driven into the street. From one of them a young man helped his sweetheart to alight. He took hold of her arm with a certain air of tenderness, and a hunger to be touched thus tenderly by a man's hand that had come to Mary many times before, returned at almost the same moment her father made the announcement of his approaching death. As the doctor began to speak, Barney Smithfield, who owned a livery barn that opened into Tremont Street, directly opposite the building in which the Cochranes lived, came back to his place of business from his evening meal. He stopped to tell a story to a group of men gathered before the barn door, and a shout of laughter arose. One of the loungers in the street, a strongly built young man in a checkered suit, stepped away from the others and stood before the liveryman. Having seen Mary, he was trying to attract her attention. He also began to tell a story, and as he talked he gesticulated, waved his arms, and from time to time looked over his shoulder to see if the girl still stood by the window and if she were watching. Dr. Cochrane had told his daughter of his approaching death in a cold, quiet voice. To the girl it had seemed that everything concerning her father must be cold and quiet. "I have a disease of the heart," he said flatly. "Have long suspected there was something of the sort the matter with me, and on Thursday, when I went into Chicago, I had myself examined. The truth is I may die at any moment. I would not tell you, but for one reason. I will leave little money, and you must be making plans for the future." The doctor stepped nearer the window where his daughter stood with her hand on the frame. The announcement had made her a little pale, and her hand trembled. In spite of his apparent coldness, he was touched and wanted to reassure her. "There now," he said hesitatingly. "It'll likely be all right after all. Don't worry. I haven't been a doctor for 30 years without knowing there's a great deal of nonsense about these pronouncements on the part of experts in a matter like this. That is to say, when a man has a disease of the heart, he may potter about for years. He laughed uncomfortably. I've even heard it said that the best way to ensure a long life is to contract a disease of the heart. With these words, the doctor had turned and walked out of his office, going down a wooden stairway to the street. He had wanted to put his arm about his daughter's shoulder as he talked to her, but never having shown any feeling in his relations with her could not sufficiently release some tight thing in himself. Mary had stood for a long time looking down into the street. The young man, in the checkered suit, whose name was Duke Yetter, had finished telling his tale and a shout of laughter arose. She turned to look toward the door through which her father had passed, and dread took possession of her. In all her life, there had never been anything warm and close. She shivered, although the night was warm, and with a quick girlish gesture passed her hand over her eyes. The gesture was but an expression of a desire to brush away the cloud of fear that had settled down upon her, but it was misinterpreted by Duke Yetter, who now stood a little apart from the other men before the livery barn. When he saw Mary's hand go up, he smiled, and turning quickly to be sure he was unobserved, began jerking his head and making motions with his hand as a sign that he wished her to come down into the street, where he would have an opportunity to join her. On the Sunday evening, Mary, having walked through Upper Main, turned into Wilmot, a street of workmen's houses. During that year, the first sign of the march of factories westward from Chicago into the prairie towns had come to Huntersburg. A Chicago manufacturer of furniture had built a plant in the sleepy little farming town, hoping thus to escape the labor organizations that had begun to give him trouble in the city. At the upper end of town, in Wilmot, Swift, Harrison, and Chestnut streets, and in cheap, badly constructed frame houses, most of the factory workers lived. On the warm summer evening, they were gathered on the porches at the front of the houses, and a mob of children played in the dusty streets. Red-faced men in white shirts and without collars and coats slept in chairs or lay sprawled on strips of grass or on the hard earth before the doors of the houses. The laborers' wives had gathered in groups and stood gossiping by the fences that separated the yards. Occasionally, the voice of one of the women arose sharp and distinct above the steady flow of voices that ran like a murmuring river through the hot little streets. In the roadway, two children had got into a fight. A thick-shouldered, red-haired boy struck another boy who had a pale, sharp-featured face, a blow on the shoulder. Other children came running. The mother of the red-haired boy brought the promised fight to an end. "Stop it, Johnny. I tell you to stop it. I'll break your neck if you don't," the woman screamed. The pale boy turned and walked away from his antagonist. As he went slinking along the sidewalk past Mary Cochran, his sharp little eyes, burning with hatred, looked up at her. Mary went quickly along the strange new part of her native town with the hubbub of life, always stirring and asserting itself, had a strong fascination for her. There was something dark and resentful in her own nature that made her feel at home in the crowded place where life carried itself off darkly, with a blow and an oath. The habitual silence of her father and the mystery concerning the unhappy married life of her father and mother that had affected the attitude toward her of the people of the town had made her own life a lonely one, and had encouraged in her a rather dogged determination to, in some way, think her own way through the things of life she could not understand. And back of Mary's thinking there was an intense curiosity and a courageous determination toward adventure. She was like a little animal of the forest that has been robbed of its mother by the gun of a sportsman and has been driven by hunger to go forth and seek food. 20 times during the year she had walked alone at evening in the new and fast-growing factory district of her town. She was 18 and had begun to look like a woman, and she felt that other girls of the town of her own age would not have dared to walk in such a place alone. The feeling made her somewhat proud, and as she went along she looked boldly about. Among the workers in Wilmot Street, men and women who had been brought to town by the furniture manufacturer, were many who spoke in foreign tongues. Mary walked among them and liked the sound of the strange voices. To be in the street made her feel that she had gone out of her town and on a voyage into a strange land. In Lower Main Street or in the residence streets in the eastern part of town, where lived the young men and women she had always known, and where lived also the merchants, the clerks, the lawyers, and the more well-to-do American workmen of Huntersburg, she felt always a secret antagonism to herself. The antagonism was not due to anything in her own character. She was sure of that. She had kept so much to herself that she was in fact but little known. "It is because I am the daughter of my mother," she told herself, and did not walk often in the part of town where other girls of her class lived. Mary had been so often in Wilmot Street that many of the people had begun to feel acquainted with her. "She is the daughter of some farmer and has got into the habit of walking into town," they said. A red-haired, broad-hipped woman who came out at the front door of one of the houses nodded to her. On a narrow strip of grass beside another house sat a young man with his back against a tree. He was smoking a pipe, but when he looked up and saw her, he took the pipe from his mouth. She decided he must be an Italian, his hair and eyes were so black. "Ni bella, si fai un onore a passer di qua," he called, waving his hand and smiling. Mary went to the end of Wilmot Street and came out upon a country road. It seemed to her that a long time must have passed since she left her father's presence, although the walk had in fact occupied but a few minutes. By the side of the road and on top of a small hill there was a ruined barn, and before the barn a great hole filled with the charred timbers of what had once been a farmhouse. A pile of stones lay beside the hole, and these were covered with creeping vines. Between the site of the house and the barn there was an old orchard in which grew a mass of tangled weeds. Pushing her way in among the weeds, many of which were covered with blossoms, Mary found herself a seat on a rock that had been rolled against the trunk of an old apple tree. The weeds half concealed her, and from the road only her head was visible. Buried away thus in the weeds, she looked like a quail that runs in the tall grass, and that on hearing some unusual sound, stops, throws up its head, and looks sharply about. The doctor's daughter had been to the decayed old orchard many times before. At the foot of the hill on which it stood the streets of the town began, and as she sat on the rock she could hear faint shouts and cries coming out of Wilmot Street. A hedge separated the orchard from the fields on the hillside. Mary intended to sit by the tree until darkness came creeping over the land and to try to think out some plan regarding her future. The notion that her father was soon to die seemed both true and untrue, but her mind was unable to take hold of the thought of him as physically dead. For the moment death in relation to her father did not take the form of a cold, inanimate body that was to be buried in the ground. Instead, it seemed to her that her father was not to die, but to go away somewhere on a journey. Long ago, her mother had done that. There was a strange, hesitating sense of relief in the thought. "Well," she told herself, "when the time comes I also shall be setting out. I shall get out of here and into the world." On several occasions Mary had gone to spend a day with her father in Chicago, and she was fascinated by the thought that soon she might be going there to live. Before her mind's eye floated a vision of long streets filled with thousands of people, all strangers to herself. To go into such streets and to live her life among strangers would be like coming out of a waterless desert and into a cool forest carpeted with tender young grass. In Huntersburg, she had always lived under a cloud, and now she was becoming a woman, and the close, stuffy atmosphere she had always breathed was becoming constantly more and more oppressive. It was true no direct question had ever been raised touching her own standing in the community life, but she felt that a kind of prejudice against her existed. While she was still a baby, there had been a scandal involving her father and mother. The town of Huntersburg had rocked with it, and when she was a child people had sometimes looked at her with mocking, sympathetic eyes. "Poor child, it's too bad," they said. Once, on a cloudy summer evening when her father had driven off to the country and she sat alone in the darkness by his office window, she heard a man and woman in the street mention her name. The couple stumbled along in the darkness on the sidewalk below the office window. "That daughter of Doc Cochran's is a nice girl," said the man. The woman laughed. "She's growing up and attracting men's attention now. Better keep your eyes in your head. She'll turn out bad like mother, like daughter," the woman replied. For 10 or 15 minutes Mary sat on the stone beneath the tree in the orchard and thought of the attitude of the town toward herself and her father. "It should have drawn us together," she told herself, and wondered if the approach of death would do what the cloud that had for years hung over them had not done. It did not at the moment seem to her cruel that the figure of death was soon to visit her father. In a way, death had become for her, and for the time, a lovely and gracious figure intent upon good. The hand of death was to open the door out of her father's house and into life. With the cruelty of youth, she thought first of the adventurous possibilities of the new life. Mary sat very still. In the long weeds the insects that had been disturbed in their evening song began to sing again. A robin flew into the tree beneath which she sat and struck a clear, sharp note of alarm. The voices of people in the town's new factory district came softly up the hillside. They were like bells of distant cathedrals calling people to worship. Something within the girl's breast seemed to break, and putting her head into her hands, she rocked slowly back and forth. Tears came accompanied by a warm, tender impulse toward the living men and women of Huntersburg. And then from the road came a call. "Hello there, kid," shouted a voice, and Mary sprang quickly to her feet. Her mellow mood passed like a puff of wind, and in its place hot anger came. In the road stood Duke Yetter, who from his loafing place before the livery barn had seen her set out for the Sunday evening walk and had followed. When she went through Upper Main Street and into the new factory district, he was sure of his conquest. "She doesn't want to be seen walking with me," he had told himself. "That's all right. She knows well enough I'll follow, but doesn't want me to put in an appearance until she is well out of sight of her friends. She's a little stuck up and needs to be brought down a peg. But what do I care? She's gone out of her way to give me this chance, and maybe she's only afraid of her dad." Duke climbed the little incline out of the road and came into the orchard, but when he reached the pile of stones covered by vines, he stumbled and fell. He arose and laughed. Mary had not waited for him to reach her, but had started toward him, and when his laugh broke the silence that lay over the orchard, she sprang forward and with her open hand struck him a sharp blow on the cheek. Then she turned, and as he stood with his feet tangled in the vines, ran out to the road. "If you follow or speak to me, I'll get someone to kill you," she shouted. Mary walked along the road and down the hill toward Wilmot Street. Broken bits of the story concerning her mother that had for years circulated in town had reached her ears. Her mother, it was said, had disappeared on a summer night long ago, and a young town rough, who had been in the habit of loitering before Barney Smithfield's livery barn, had gone away with her. Now another young rough was trying to make up to her. The thought made her furious. Her mind groped about, striving to lay hold of some weapon with which she could strike a more telling blow at Duke Yetter. In desperation it lit upon the figure of her father, already broken in health and now about to die. "My father just wants the chance to kill some such fellow as you," she shouted, turning to face the young man, who, having got clear of the mass of vines in the orchard, had followed her into the road. "My father just wants to kill someone because of the lies that have been told in this town about mother." Having given way to the impulse to threaten Duke Yetter, Mary was instantly ashamed of her outburst and walked rapidly along, the tears running from her eyes. With hanging head, Duke walked at her heels. "I didn't mean no harm, Miss Cochran," he pleaded. "I didn't mean no harm. Don't tell your father. I was only funning with you. I tell you I didn't mean no harm."